You can call yourself a monster, giant, beast, Goliath, the rock, any king with this rock in my sling up. I've been hunting all day, boy. I've been hunting all day.
Hello, my name is Robbie. On here, I'm Templar Knight. Every person who believes in God but does not go to a church has a story why. But whenever two or more people gather in God's name, He is there. So this is church. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. We're getting closer to the end of our Fearless series, but we're not there yet. Tonight, we are continuing the story of David. Who remembers where we left off? I'm sure Amy does because she hates the cliffhangers. David's son, Absalom, has just led a rebellion against him, and he has brought his army to Jerusalem to find out that David is not there. Instead of standing his ground and fighting for his city, David took his family, his friends, those closest to him, his army, those that are loyal, and he left. Now, why does an unbeatable general leave an impregnable fortress when someone comes to attack? Because this fortress is his city of Jerusalem. The people who live there are God's people. They're his people. He would rather give up the city than let there be bloodshed. So David left Jerusalem, and he goes back into the wilderness, where he grew up, his stories as a young man, when he was first running from King Saul. He was in the wild, and he ain't as young as he used to be. He's getting older, he's getting up there in years, and this camping and hiking, going through the fields, the plains, the deserts, the forests, that's a young man's trade. It's not as easy as it used to be. But you can't say that David didn't feel at home back in his deserts, in his caves, in his forest. So what does he do? Does what he always does. He continues to write songs, write his poems. He continues to praise God. He continues to seek God's guidance so that he can be ready for whatever God has next. Now, I'm sure that the nomadic life was a little hard on his family and friends, especially those who had grown up in the palace lifestyle. But in a lot of ways, this was something that they really needed to experience too. To go from having everything to having nothing. That's something worth experiencing. And so David and his men, they prepare for the upcoming war. They settle back into their classic guerrilla warband tactics. And they wait for God's will to be shown. So if we go back to Jerusalem, do you guys remember the first thing that King David did when he founded the city of Jerusalem? His first act, his first major decision was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to his city, to give it a more permanent home. And so he did, so that God could continue to pour out his blessings to everyone around. Because you guys remember what happened when the Ark stopped in that farmhouse, the home of Obed-Edom. Remember what happened in just 3 months of being there? The crops flourished, the animals flourished, everything was blessed by having the Ark there. So David had to have the Ark in Jerusalem. That was his first decision. He was truly a king. He is truly a king after God's heart. So what is the first thing that Jerusalem's second king, Absalom, what's his first major act? Well, he hears that David left his concubines behind to manage the palace while he was away. Now, we have a negative intonation when we hear the word concubine, but a concubine was basically a wife without a title. They weren't prostitutes. They weren't ladies of the night. They were still loyal to their one man. They were an official and respected member of the household. They just weren't wives. So like many of the servants who managed the palace, the concubines stayed behind. And when Absalom heard that these women were there, he took them, one by one, to the roof of the palace. And he raped them for all to see. Now, we gotta take a step back and think about this for a second. Absalom. This man who was so poisoned by the rape of his sister, by the lack of the punishment for her rapist, that he let this bitterness and anger turn him into a murderer. It turned him into an exile, into an arsonist who burned the fields of his friend just because his friend wouldn't respond to his messengers. He led a rebellion against his father. And now it's come full circle, and he has become a rapist himself. See, Absalom, he could never forgive what happened to his sister. And his constant focus on that one wound, instead of trying to heal and move on, it festered and it poisoned him. And it turned him into the very monster that he hated. It's an interesting way to start your rule as king, man. Definitely a way to burn bridges. To let the entire city know that you and your father are never going to reconcile again. So while Absalom is finding out how horrible a king he is, what's David doing? Well, David is preparing to attack. Because that's what David does. David does not do defense. He's never had to defend. And we get to see David fall back on his very first battle strategy. The first time he ever showed his military genius. When you are facing a bigger, stronger enemy with an impenetrable guard, how do you fight them? It's simple. You get the giant to come out from behind his shield. Just like in fighting Goliath, David knows how to fight Absalom, while he now holds the impenetrable fortress of Jerusalem. David lets his location be known, and he splits his army into 3 smaller groups. Because in the wilderness, his seasoned warriors, man, this is their home. These guerrilla tactics, it's second nature to them. This is what they grew up doing. And it greatly weighed the battle in their favor against a larger, inexperienced host. But David would not lead his men into battle this time. Mainly because Absalom didn't care about the army. He just needed David dead. So David has to stay out of this fight and stay safe. So after dividing the men under his 3 main generals, he sends them out to fight with one request. His request is that you please do not kill my son. He may be leading armies against us, but he is still my boy. So the armies disperse. They fall back into what they know, the way they know how to fight. And David stays safe. And just like King Saul, when Absalom hears of David's location, he takes his army and he runs off into the wilderness. Now, at least Saul was a good warrior. He was a smart leader. Absalom was just a headstrong pretty boy, a royal princeling who let his anger lead him. It did not go well. In the battle to come, over half of Absalom's men were killed by the wilderness alone. Charging through terrain they didn't understand and didn't know, they fell into pits and into crevasses, they fell off cliffs, tripped over tree roots, broke legs, injured their mounts. Opposing David and his men in this wilderness, well, let's just say it was kind of embarrassing. Really, the only good thing that could be said about this was that Absalom was so incompetent that he got so many of his men killed by the wilderness that David and his men did not have to kill that many of their fellow Israelites. Because again, this is Israel versus Israel now. Absalom led a rebellion with people he was able to pull away from David. So for David's men not to have to kill these people was probably better for them. Absalom was so certain that with the bigger host, that meant he wins, right? It's all about numbers. Absalom should have read the history books about what happens any time David goes to war. So when he realized it was too late, he fled. By the time he realized he no longer had a chance to win this battle, watching his men get dropped, he turns to flee. And one of the craziest scenes in the Bible happens. But for this to make sense, I need to explain a little bit about Absalom. Now, you probably saw this when we first hopped in. This was Absalom, or at least a rendition of him, a picture created. Absalom, expert politician, failed warrior. I saw that on there. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to leave it. Absalom was a handsome man. He looked just like his father. You know, David was gorgeous. Look at the statues if you don't believe me. You can still see pictures of, you can still see what David looked like. David was a gorgeous man. Absalom had his father's look. It even said in the Bible that Absalom was the model of what a man should look like. But he was very vain. He knew he was good looking. He knew he was a prince. Well, he had this habit of only trimming his hair only once in a year or so, whenever it became too heavy for his head to hold up. So we're not talking like Fabio, you know, with the locks blowing in the wind. We're talking hair that was down to his waist, sometimes even longer, flowing in the wind. So this handsome man is fleeing through the forest on his mule, his beautiful hair fluttering in the wind. Well, his hair whips up and it gets snagged in a tree branch, and it pulls him from his mount and leaves him hanging there by his hair. I was so baffled by this. Here, let me show. Riding through the forest, his hair blowing in the wind, it flaps up, gets snagged in a tree, and pulls him from his mount. Yeah. So that happened. So, while Absalom is fleeing, gets snagged in a tree, hanging there by his hair. He gets found by David's soldiers. Now, the group of David's soldiers that find him, they're being led by Joab. Y'all remember Joab by now, I hope. He's the dude, one of David's top generals. He's a great fighter, he's a great leader, and he is quick to obey. He's that tough general who's there to do the hard things. So Joab's men, they find Absalom hanging from this tree. They leave a few men to guard him, and they send for Joab. Because, mind you, they were given specific orders from David. Don't kill Absalom. You guys remember what David did to the guy who claimed he killed Saul? And what happened to the guys who killed King Ishbosheth? The soldiers remember. They know better. David said Absalom lives. They are not going to be the ones to kill him. So Joab arrives at this tree. And he sees Absalom just hanging around, swaying. Oh, God, it would be funny if it wasn't so true. He sees him just hanging around. And before anyone can do anything, he pulls out his bow. And he shoots 3 arrows into Absalom's heart, killing him before the men could even think to question their leader. Or maybe it was better that they don't question their leader. Joab then orders 10 of his men to drive their swords through him before cutting him down. And so ends the story of King Absalom. You won't be missed, buddy. Now, I'm sure the soldiers were a little worried because David said he wasn't supposed to die. And Joab looks at him and says, "If this was not the will of God, then I will answer to him for it. But first, I will have to answer to David." So a messenger returns to David's camp to share the news of the victorious battle and the death of Absalom. He runs in, jumping off his horse, boasting with great news. "Our enemies are dead. The rebel leader is slain. We can return home to Jerusalem." And hearing this, everyone there is overjoyed with his words of victory. Everyone except David. David is heartbroken over the loss of his child. Now again, David wasn't a good father, but he did love his kids. Very much so. He loved his children so much that he was blind to the monster that Absalom had become. And maybe that's just a parent thing. You will always love your children, no matter what they do. So hearing of this victory, David is crushed by this news. And he wept and he fell into despair, mourning the loss of his little baby boy that he once held and he raised to be a man. He didn't celebrate the murder or the death of a murderer. He didn't celebrate the death of a rapist, the death of a man who led a rebellion against him. So they returned to Jerusalem, somber. Not a sound of victory or celebration. David was too devastated. And seeing their leader broken like this, it broke them too. it was not the return that these soldiers deserved. So Joab, the guy who always does what needs to be done, seeing the way his soldiers return, he goes to David, pushes through the door. "My king, did you not know? We won this war." But David is still overcome with grief, and he's weeping in despair and says, "My son is dead." Joab, not willing to give an inch. "The rebel who murdered your son Amnon, who raped your concubines and led an army to kill you, is dead. And yes, I am sure you have heard that he died at my hand. I killed him because it had to be done, my lord. Would you rather he were alive and that all of us were dead?" "No, but he was my son." "He was a monster, and I would kill him again if needed. I would kill him and anyone who stands against you because you are my king. And all of these men out there are willing to fight, to kill, and die for you if needed. And instead of celebrating their victory, you mourn as though we lost this battle. I know that the father in you is hurting, but right now, the king in you needs to step up and congratulate your men and celebrate this victory with them. Later, when you are alone and the time is right, you can continue to mourn your son. But right now, your people need their king. And if you are not going to be the king they need, what will happen when the next rebel shows up, wanting to be a king who treats his men better than you?" David sees the wisdom in this. He puts his grief aside, and he goes to receive his soldiers. Being a king ain't easy, and I'm sure he would have rather have been a father first. But those soldiers needed him more. So with the rebellion of Absalom over, the problem with rebellion is that once the story spread, they continue to spread. If David's own son didn't think he was fit to rule, why should he rule me? Why should this aging old man still have authority over what I do and what I say? So there was another rebellion. It was led by Sheba, a Benjamite, who felt that David was no longer fit to rule because he was Hebron, saying that David didn't care for the other tribes. But this rebellion was put down by Joab, again going out, doing what needed to be done. Then there were more. David could not just live in peace, spend the rest of his years growing old and watching his family. There were still rebels, still people who wanted to question him. So we are going to move forward to one of the bigger rebellions. One that's got a few familiar faces. See, the next rebellion came from his former adversaries, the Philistines. Now, the last time David fought them was during his conquest to expand Israel, where he defeated them, and he allowed 1/3 of their army to live to tell the story, to return home, never to take up arms again. But apparently they forgot, because they're up again, and they're looking for a fight. So David gathers the army of Israel, and they go to war. But this time, the Philistine giants have come out to play. The brothers and sons of Goliath have taken to the battlefield to fight for the freedom of their nation, to break away from Israel's rule. They are throwing everything they got into this war. Victory would mean their freedom, to be their own country again. But the cost of losing this war would make them an irrelevant military force for generations to come. So David gathers the army, and they go to fight. And in one of these battles, the aging King David, fighting alongside his men, comes up against one of these giants. David's getting old. He does not have the stamina he used to. He may still be David the Great, but he is not the great fighter he once was. Thankfully, David's men are there, and the giant is slain. Now it's made clear to David at this point, you are too old to be in the front lines. You need to stay out of combat. Lead from the back. Tell us where to go and what to do. So he does. David puts aside his pride, and he takes a safe position in the rear to allow the next generation of soldiers to step up and prove their worth. And they do. Splendidly. See, when David was a boy, soldiers thought that you could not kill a giant. But David proved to them that even a kid can bring down a giant if led by the Lord. So under God's guidance, and inspired by what David has already shown them can be done, this next generation of heroes also earns the title Giant Slayers. When standing before a giant with God on their side, they knew it could be done. And so they fought, and they brought the mighty down. Now, one very key point that I need to point out, need to bring to everyone's attention on this, was David's response. When David sees these young soldiers slay giants, or he hears the tales of a battle that he wasn't at, he doesn't get all prideful and caught up in jealousy and focusing on being too old to fight. He doesn't put all the focus on him and what he did. In fact, he does the exact opposite. He celebrates with them. He brags about what they have done. The king, boasting about the acts of his soldiers. He even wrote them all down. He made a book so that we could remember that Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, killed a giant. Sabekah, a Hushiatite, killed a giant. Elhanan, the son of a weaver from Bethlehem, killed a giant. And Jonathan, the son of David's older brother Shimea, also killed a giant. "3,000 years later, and I can tell you their names. I know who they are and what they did because David chose to honor them and boast about their great deeds, instead of focusing all on him and how great he was back in the day. He built up the story and the confidence of those around him. So in the Bible, we know that David killed Goliath, but there was no mention of David's king when that happened, because his king opposed him. But when we read in the Bible about this final war against Philistine, although David never actually took much part in the fight, in the Bible it says that David and his men killed the giants. And David gets part of the credit because he was a proper leader. And he shared in the glory of this victory. Unlike Saul, who was a good fighter, but was threatened by losing what he had from the next generation, David encouraged them. David celebrated with them, and he coached them so that they would be confident and ready to lead and to step up, because they are the future. This time, the Philistines were beaten badly. With the loss of their giants and so many soldiers in battle, the Philistines took a gamble and they lost. They are no longer a military threat in Israel. They have finally learned their place. So the aging David returns to Jerusalem to continue writing his poems and his songs, to sing and to praise the Lord, knowing that his time is near, knowing he will soon be leaving this world to go and be with his God in heaven, where he will be able to write, sing, praise, and dance again. He prepares. But there are still a few more things that David needs to address before it is time for him to go.
You can call yourself a monster, giant, beast, Goliath, a rock any king with this rock in my sling.